Well, hey there, everybody. Jake Fried here. Today, I'm going to be talking about the February 2017 Public Forum Debate Resolution, all about U.S. and Cuba relations, specifically on whether or not the U.S. should actually lift its very long-standing embargo with the island nation of Cuba. So the resolved states just like this: the United States should lift its embargo against Cuba. It seems very straightforward. It seems like there may not be a whole lot of debate in terms of how the resolution is worded, but I actually think there are quite a few areas that you may want to explore specifically with the wording of the resolution, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a few minutes. What you can expect with this video is a rundown of some of the sources that I think you need to make sure you look into, some really credible sources for this topic, some background research that you need to do before you really start to write your case and kind of dig your heels into this resolution. And then I'll talk about some of the points that I've come up with, some frameworks that I think you might see, and I'll end it with a couple of strategies that I really think will help you in the round specifically with this resolution. Before we jump into some of my strategies, my analysis, and my tips, I want to remind you that this topic is very similar, eerily similar to the NFL topic that was used back in 2009. And if your coach has access to the DVD, or you can also watch it through your speechanddebate.org website, I would highly recommend you watch that. The 2009 resolution was that the United States should normalize relations with Cuba, which pretty much was asking us to discuss the embargo. And here we are again several years later, and we're still discussing it. So the first thing that I would like you to look into and think about is, how are you going to define what the embargo is? A lot of times people want to just jump straight into their cases. They want to jump straight into their contentions. I don't think that's a really smart idea with this particular resolution, because it is imperative that you define what the embargo is. You can't assume that your judge knows anything about this topic. And as I always say, if you have a confused judge, that's a really bad situation, because you have no idea how they are going to vote, and that is not a good thing. So think about how you're going to define the embargo. Obviously, you don't want to spend too much time here, because that will take away from some of your analysis and some of your arguments later on in your speech, especially the constructive speech. So I want you to think in Twitter version. If you had to tweet out exactly what the embargo is, how could you fit that down into a very short version? I think it's very critical that you do this in your first constructive speech. And also think about it was kind of similar to the topic back in, I believe it was October or November, when it talked about the Internet of Things. I really think the first speaker has a strong advantage in terms of setting the narrative for the round. And if you get up there and you really lay out very clearly what the embargo is, not only are you doing yourself a favor, you're actually making the judge feel more comfortable about the topic, more comfortable with you. And if you can make that connection with the judge and make them feel comfortable, sort of empower them that they know exactly what you're talking about, you've really gone a long way in terms of winning them over. And you can do that within the first minute of your constructive speech. So moving on from that, I want to talk about a couple of things that it is very important to research. A lot of you may have already started thinking about your contentions. You may have some of your cases already written. If you have not come across something known as the Helms-Burton Act, stop immediately, and you need to go research this act. This was something that was passed in the 1990s that actually strengthened the embargo that is in place between the U.S. and Cuba, and it is a critical part of this resolution. I think it's going to come up in every single round, possibly even every single speech in every single round. So if you're not familiar with the Helms-Burton Act, you need to become extremely familiar with it, know it backwards and forwards, regardless of what side of the resolution you're going to be on, because like I said, I think that's going to be one of the, if not the most important things that actually comes up during this debate. Obviously, you want to research U.S.-Cuba relations, and there's actually a really good article that was written by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is one source that I think you need to do a lot of research with. You'll find some really good sources from that agency So research U.S.-Cuba relations, get a good idea of the background. This is not just something that's happened within the last 5 years. This embargo has been in place for decades. So there is a lot of background research, a lot of different areas to research, and a lot of areas you want to make sure that you're familiar with, because any of it could come up during the round, and I certainly don't want you to be caught off guard by anything. Not only do I want you to sort of familiarize yourself with the background of what this topic is about with the U.S. and Cuba relations, but also look into Cuba's relations with other countries over the same time period. I think that's going to offer you some, possibly even some contentions, if you can research and see how Cuba is relating with other countries or trading with other countries, and how that might be a model for what could be done with the United States. So that's something very important to also look into. I think it's going to come up a lot as well. Good sources to try and find information. I'm just going to read these off to you. You can, if you miss one of these, you can rewind this video just a bit. Council on Foreign Relations, that's a big one. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs has a lot of information about the U.S. and Cuba ongoing scenario. Human Rights Watch, I'll talk in a little bit about how human rights violations is something that Cuba is notorious for doing, and I think it is important in this topic. So Human Rights Watch, that's going to give you a lot of information about those human rights violations that Cuba has been found guilty of doing in the past several decades. The Pew Research Center is going to give you a lot of information on sort of the feelings. How do Americans feel about the embargo? How do Cubans feel about the embargo? Do they think it's working? Do they think it needs to be repealed? Do they think it needs to stay in place? That's going to give you a lot of good statistics that you can plug into different parts of your speech. That was Pew Research Center. It's a great resource, not just for this topic, but really for anything. It's one of my favorites. The Office of Foreign Assets Control is another area you can research in. And then the last one I have written down is the National Center for Policy Analysis. These sources are going to be very credible, very strong in the round. And, you know, a lot of times these debates come down to who has the better sources. You'll be good to go researching in those different areas. So with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about some of the arguments that I think will be effective, that I think you'll hear a lot of in this debate. I'll start off with the pro side, I'll end with the con side, and then again I'm going to talk about some frameworks and then also just a couple of strategies. So during my research in the past couple of days, one of the overwhelming things that I noticed in terms of what might work for the pro side, and you probably have noticed this as well, is that lifting the embargo is actually supported not only by people here in the US, including political figures, but also the international community as a whole. If you do research on how the United Nations feels about the US-Cuba embargo, they have wanted it to be lifted for quite some time. President Obama in the past couple of years has done a lot to sort of ease the restrictions and ease the tension, so to speak, between the US and Cuba. And the way you can use this argument is that that's all leading to, let's just go ahead and lift it because all of these steps have already been taken. You can also look at the economic impact that lifting the embargo would have on the United States. You can also look at the economic impact that lifting the embargo would have on Cuba. Also, lifting the embargo on Cuba, that might put pressure on Cuba to actually fix some of these human rights violations that they have been doing for several decades. And the research shows there's really not been any sign of that going away anytime soon. And it all could be because of the embargo. That's what you can debate about. Also, going back to the Helms-Burton Act, you can talk about how the fact that that act has just simply failed. It's time to let it expire. It's time to start a new era, a new chapter in relations between the U.S. and Cuba. You can also look at, remember I was talking about researching how Cuba deals with other countries and how that could be a model for the United States. I think some of that could work really well in here as well. So those are just a couple of the arguments that I think you really want to explore, especially the economic impact. I think that's going to be a very large part of this debate, because at its core, the embargo is an embargo on trade. It's affecting economics at its core. And so I think that's a very important aspect that you need to research and have a whole lot of information on, and try to overwhelm your opponents with all of the economic impacts, not only on the US, but also on Cuba. And trust me, there is a lot of research out there that will support your arguments in that respect. Now, on the flip side, I do think a lot of pro teams are going to maybe take the strategy of talking about how the embargo was put in place to try to promote democracy in Cuba. It's been a communist nation for several decades, and the whole idea was, we want Cuba to be a democratic nation so that we can have better relations with them. And so I would explore sort of how the embargo is either prohibiting democracy, or it's actually helping democracy, or will help democracy in the future. Obviously, depending on what side of the resolution you are, you'll be debating on, that will come up. So the economic impact, and also the impact on human rights, and also the promotion of democracy. You can easily make an argument that the Helms-Burton Act, and therefore the embargo itself, is largely solely there to promote democracy. And if you're on the con side, you could easily say it hasn't done so yet, therefore it does not need to be repealed. What's interesting is that this is very similar to the December topic in Colombia, whether it was, or it was some previous topic. It may not have been the Columbia resolution, but the base argument is X has not worked yet, therefore we should repeal it, or X has not worked yet, therefore we should not repeal it. It's a very, very two polar opposite arguments that you could run away with on this resolution. And it's going to come down to who has the better arguments, who has the better impacts, who has the better evidence, because I feel like you could just as easily say it hasn't worked, so let's repeal it. You could also say it hasn't worked yet, let's not repeal it. So with that being said, I want to jump into some of the arguments on the con, which you're saying that the embargo should not be lifted. One of the biggest things, and I think this will be a very effective argument based on what's happening in the United States with a new president coming into office, a new administration, and also with the political uncertainty that's happening in Cuba. Obviously, Fidel Castro, who was the leader for several decades, passed away in 2016, but his brother, younger brother, Raul Castro, actually took over office in the mid-2000s. So he's been in office for a couple of years, but he is in his 80s, he's aging, so there's some uncertainty both in Cuba and also in the United States that really lends itself to saying, wait a minute, let's not lift this embargo. There's just way too much uncertainty. There is research out there that suggests if you just lift the embargo like that, that could cause a violent change in Cuba, that there just would be so much turmoil with something as significant and long-lasting as this embargo has been, that could, in effect, lead to almost a civil war or some kind of crisis that could be avoided if we just leave the embargo in place. So really explore the political uncertainty here in the U.S. with the new administration. How does Trump feel about Cuba? What has he said? What are some of the projections? How do those differ from what Obama has done in the past couple of years of his presidency? And also look into the uncertainty of what's going to happen in Cuba. Who might take over after Raul Castro passes away? Again, he's in his 80s, he's aging. So that is definitely something you absolutely have to think about, just simply because of his age and of his health. And also, if there were to be some kind of crisis in Cuba, that could lead to a mass exodus of people into the United States. I think it would be very helpful to take a map of Cuba and the United States into the round with you. They're only separated by less than 100 miles. So the geographic location of Cuba is also very important for that very reason. That is something we have to be concerned about, that mass exodus of people, if Cuba were to go into some kind of civil war of some sorts. Now, I want to talk about the Helms-Burton Act again. Now, on the con side, again, this is what I was mentioning earlier. The Helms-Burton Act, and you'll see this once you research it, it's got a long list of criteria that Cuba has to meet in order for the U.S. to let the embargo be lifted. A very, very long list. There are a ton of arguments you can make. Two of the main ones that I think might be easiest to use and easiest for the judge to understand: political oppression. Cuba is still doing that despite the ease and sanctions from the Obama administration the past couple of years. There's really no sign that political oppression has lessened. And so if Cuba is not willing to lessen its political oppression and allow freedom of speech and allow freedom of information and freedom of technology, why should we lift this embargo? What have they done to prove to us that they have a commitment to not throwing all of these political dissidents in jail over and over and over and over? So that's something I would really look into. Also, the commitment to democracy. Again, the embargo itself, I think you could make a very easy argument that at its core, the idea was to promote democracy in Cuba, to not let any other government sort of rule. Obviously, that hasn't worked in the past 50 years. But look at the commitment to democracy. If we just lift the embargo with no terms, I mean, what's going to happen? Who knows? There's a lot of uncertainty with that, and I think you can use that to your advantage. Make the judge feel uncomfortable in voting for the pro. You should put the position of, there's just too much uncertainty. We're not sure what will happen if we lift this embargo. Therefore, we should not lift the embargo. In effect, if you are voting pro, you're saying that absolutely without a doubt, we should lift the embargo. If you can cast any type of doubt on any one of those arguments that the pro brings up, you're probably well on your way to winning the round if you do that effectively. Another point on the con I want to make is that Cuba's trade with other countries, yes, they trade with many other countries, has not created really economic prosperity. So there's a lot of research showing how much the U.S. is missing out on economic impact because of the embargo, how much Cuba, the Cuban people, are missing out because of the embargo. There's a lot of research to show that Cuba's trading with these other countries, and what we're saying will happen if the U.S. trades with Cuba in a totally free and open trade kind of deal, it's not happening now. So why should I believe that lifting the embargo is going to all of a sudden make all those changes? I think that's a very, very effective argument, and I would have a lot of statistics, and they're out there to support that. So that's kind of an overview of where I think some of the main pro arguments are, and also some of the main con arguments are. I want to talk a little bit about frameworks, and then end on a couple of strategies for you. I think the two main frameworks, depending on what side you're going to be on, are going to be a cost-benefit analysis. How much is this embargo costing the U.S. versus how much could we make if it was lifted? I think that's going to be very popular, and certainly is very valid for this resolution. And also, I think a utilitarian kind of framework. We want to improve the lives of the Cuban people by lifting the embargo. By lifting the embargo, we're also improving the lives of the American economy, those who would benefit, farmers and other businesses that would stand to make a lot of profit by being able to trade with Cuba openly without any type of restrictions. So I think those are going to be two of the main frameworks that you're going to see. One thing I do want to address, and I was mentioning this kind of in the beginning, was that the resolution itself seems very straightforward, but notice how the resolution does not put any time restrictions on, if you support this, when would it be lifted? Okay, if we're going to lift it, well, when? If we're not going to lift the embargo, if you're going con, are you saying absolutely never? We're never going to lift this under any circumstance whatsoever? Are you telling me there are no circumstances where you would consider lifting this embargo? I mean, even the Helms-Burton Act, if we were to meet all those requirements, if Cuba were to meet all those requirements, wouldn't you have to repeal and lift the embargo. So I think timing is going to play a big role in the resolution. And I think there are a couple of different strategies that you could make. I think the pro might attempt to say to the con what I was just saying about how, okay, you're saying we should not lift it. You're saying that never, ever, under any circumstance. I think that might be borderline a little bit abusive. The flip side of that would be we have to make a decision based on what we know right now without any. We have to assume that if it was lifted, it would be lifted immediately. That would play into the uncertainty, the political uncertainty, the social uncertainty in Cuba. So there's definitely a lot of room to play around with it, and there's certainly a lot of ground you'll have to cover in this topic just to be prepared to respond to whatever the opponent might bring up. So just be prepared for that. All right, finally, I want to talk about one strategy that will apply to any debate you ever do from here on out, and one that I think is very effective. The good news for you is not a whole lot of people do this, and I think this will really, really benefit you, especially if you have a lay judge. And it comes down to crossfire. Number one, you need to have questions ready to go before the round for crossfire. No silence. Don't ever let your opponent get two questions in a row. You always have to have something to say. So it is very, very important you have questions prepared to go. After researching both sides, you know what's going to come up. You know what questions to ask to try to promote your side, to try to discredit the other side. Have those questions ready to go. And you may not use them. You may want to devote your time to exactly what the first speaker said, but at least you have those questions there ready as a backup. Also in crossfire, do not be afraid to engage the judge. As you're sitting there talking to your opponent, don't be afraid to look over to the judge, include them in the conversation. That will also go a very long way in creating a nice connection with the judge. And I think that's very important in terms of winning them over, not just as a debater, but also specifically for that round. So again, don't be afraid to sit there, have a conversation with the judge, be very open during crossfire, and make sure to make them feel included. And I think you'll really like how they respond to that. So again, this has been a topic analysis for the February 2017 public forum debate topic. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to ask me. I'll put my contact information in the description of this video. I'm actually recording this live. It'll be uploaded shortly after I stop recording here. But if you have any questions, if you would like me to share some of the evidence that I found or some of the places where I found this evidence, I'd be more than happy to do so. And also just if you have any other questions, I would be more than happy to help you out. So good luck in February. I think this is a really exciting topic, and I cannot wait to see what cases you guys come up with. Take care.